"Security, we need this confused old man removed immediately," my son-in-law David announced loudly across the waiting area at Riverside Community Hospital. "He's having another episode and doesn't understand where he is." 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me as I sat in the plastic chair, still wearing my pajamas from the forced midnight ambulance ride. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across faces filled with pity, families staring at what appeared to be relatives dealing with an elderly man's mental breakdown. Children pressed closer to their parents, whispering questions about the sick old man. David stood with my daughter Claire near the admissions desk, both wearing expressions of concerned family members who'd reached the end of their patience. They'd planned this performance perfectly. The late-night emergency call, the detailed claims about my mental decline, the urgent need for immediate psychiatric evaluation. "He's been forgetting things for months," David told the night nurse, loud enough for everyone in the waiting area to hear. "Progressive memory loss, wandering behavior, increasing paranoia about family members. Tonight we found him outside in his pajamas at 2 in the morning, completely confused about where he lived." The nurse nodded sympathetically, making notes on her clipboard while other staff members gathered to observe the situation. David's voice carried the perfect blend of frustration and concern, painting a picture of a family overwhelmed by an elderly relative's deteriorating condition. I stayed quiet, watching the performance unfold around me. They mistook my silence for weakness, my calm demeanor for confusion, but David didn't know who I was. He didn't know that I'd worked at this hospital for 30 years before retiring, that I'd trained half the medical staff in this building, that my reputation in cardiovascular medicine extended throughout the entire medical community. He didn't know anything about the man he was trying to destroy. That night had started 5 days earlier, when David first mentioned my memory problems at what was supposed to be a peaceful family dinner. But the real story went back to the moment I'd foolishly trusted him with detailed information about my retirement savings and investment portfolio. And that was only the beginning of what would become his most expensive mistake. I should have noticed the first sign 5 days earlier, when David started asking unusually specific questions about my finances during what was supposed to be a casual family dinner at my house. He'd arrived early, before Claire and the kids, claiming he wanted to spend some quality time with me, something that should have immediately raised my suspicions. "Dad, have you been having any trouble remembering things lately? Making important financial decisions?" he'd asked while helping himself to a beer from my refrigerator, his tone carefully casual, but his eyes sharp with calculation. I'd told him retirement was treating me well, that I managed my money carefully and had everything well organized. But David kept pushing, pulling out his phone to show me article after article about elderly people making catastrophic financial mistakes due to age-related cognitive decline. "You know, I work in elder care management," he'd said, settling into my kitchen chair like he belonged there. "I see families lose their entire life saving because grandpa or grandma didn't get professional help in time. The early signs are often subtle: small memory lapses, confusion about complex decisions, resistance to accepting assistance." That phrase, resistance to accepting assistance, should have been a massive red flag. David worked for some company called Elder Care Management Services that supposedly helped families navigate the challenges of aging. But I thought he was being genuinely helpful when he offered to review my bank statements and investment portfolio. "It's just a precaution," he'd explained with that practiced smile. "Someone with your assets should really have professional oversight to ensure everything stays protected." What I didn't know was that David had been calculating exactly how much my retirement savings were worth, based on casual comments I'd made over previous family gatherings. The modest house, the careful lifestyle, the absence of flashy spending. He'd seen all of this and assumed I was just another confused old man sitting on money I couldn't properly manage anymore. David had no idea that I had spent 3 decades building my reputation as head of cardiology at Riverside Community Hospital, that I had retired quietly but maintained deep connections throughout the medical community, that my careful lifestyle was a choice rather than a limitation. He was about to discover that assumptions about elderly people can be the most expensive mistakes of your life. Looking back, I'd missed every warning sign completely, too trusting and too naive about my own son-in-law's capacity for deception, The phone call changed everything when Dr. Patricia walked into my examination room at exactly 11:47 p.m. and stopped dead in her tracks. I recognized her immediately. She'd been one of my most dedicated residents 15 years ago, now obviously risen to senior staff, based on her confident demeanor and the way other medical personnel deferred to her presence. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw me sitting on the examination table, but years of medical training kicked in as she maintained professional composure despite the obvious shock of recognition. The clipboard in her hands trembled almost imperceptibly. "Good evening, sir. I understand there are some concerns about recent cognitive changes," she said carefully, her voice neutral, but her eyes communicating volumes about what she was thinking. David jumped forward eagerly, practically vibrating with excitement at having captured a senior physician's attention. "Doctor, thank you so much for coming down to see him. Dad's been showing serious signs of dementia for months now. Progressive memory loss, increasing confusion, paranoid thoughts about family members supposedly trying to harm him." What David didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that Patricia had spent 3 years training directly under my supervision in the cardiology department. She knew my teaching methods, my diagnostic approach, my reputation for clinical excellence. She'd seen me handle medical emergencies with calm precision, watched me make complex decisions under pressure, observed my interactions with patients and colleagues for over 1,000 hours. Patricia knew that I'd never exhibited confusion, never shown paranoid behavior, never refused medical care, or demonstrated cognitive decline of any kind. In fact, she probably remembered me as one of the most mentally sharp physicians she'd encountered during her residency. "Has he been seeing his regular physician about these concerning symptoms?" Patricia asked, her question carefully worded, but designed to probe for inconsistencies in David's narrative. "Well, no, actually," David replied, his confidence growing as he sensed what he thought was medical validation of his claims. "That's been part of the problem. The paranoid thinking makes him believe that doctors and medical professionals are somehow plotting against him." Patricia's eyebrows raised slightly at this obvious falsehood. She knew that was completely impossible given my background and lifelong dedication to medical practice. David had just made his first serious mistake in front of someone who possessed intimate knowledge of exactly who he was trying to destroy, someone who could expose his entire deception with a single phone call. But the real shock came later that night when Patricia stepped out to make that call. That morning, something felt wrong when David brought coffee to my hospital bed with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He'd been pacing the hallway, making phone calls, clearly agitated that the evaluation wasn't going according to plan. "Dad, the doctor wants to keep you here for observation, just to make sure you're safe." What David didn't realize was that Patricia had stepped out to verify my identity with hospital records. She was discovering that David had provided completely false information about my medical history. David pulled out his phone and showed me documents I'd never seen before. "I've been preparing some paperwork to help protect your assets while you recover. Just basic stuff. Power of attorney, account access for emergencies." His plan was becoming clear. Get me declared mentally incompetent, gain legal control of my finances, then manage my assets for his own benefit. Classic elder exploitation. "You don't need to worry about complicated financial decisions anymore," David continued. "I'll handle everything." But David had researched my bank accounts without investigating my professional background. He knew I had money but didn't know where my connections lay. He was about to learn that targeting a retired department head at the same hospital where you're trying to commit him was catastrophically poor planning. He had no idea who he was dealing with. But the real shock came when David made his critical mistake during Patricia's second evaluation. She'd returned with questions designed to expose the inconsistencies in his story, and David was about to destroy himself completely. "Doctor, you have to understand," David said desperately. "Dad's been refusing medical care for months. That's why there's no documentation of his decline." Patricia looked at me, then back at David. "Sir, what's your father-in-law's full name?" "Robert. He's 72, retired, lives alone. That's why we're so concerned about his safety." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's face had gone completely white as the implications hit her. "Robert," she repeated slowly. "Dr. Robert, who ran cardiology here for 20 years? David's confident expression cracked. "That's impossible. He's just a retiree. He can't be some important doctor." But Patricia was already reaching for her phone. "Dr. Robert trained me personally. He's one of the most respected physicians to ever work at this hospital. David was staring at me with growing panic as his entire narrative collapsed. The confused old man he'd been planning to exploit was a medical legend at the very hospital where he was trying to commit me. His face had gone gray as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. That mistake cost him everything, and that was when I knew the trap was closing around David. Patricia stepped out briefly, then returned with the hospital administrator and a security guard. David's panic was obvious as the situation shifted completely beyond his control. "Mr. David, we need to discuss the information you provided about this patient," the administrator said calmly. Patricia explained that my medical records showed no evidence of cognitive decline, that my last physical examination indicated perfect mental function for my age. David's claims about my paranoid behavior were impossible. I'd never exhibited such symptoms. Furthermore, Patricia continued, we've found evidence that suggests this patient may have been drugged prior to admission. The blood work had revealed traces of sleep medication I hadn't knowingly consumed. David had drugged my evening tea before calling emergency services to report a confused elderly man. "Sir, did you administer any medication to your father-in-law tonight?" the administrator asked directly. David was sweating now, his carefully constructed deception unraveling in real time. He was agitated. I might have given him something to calm down. Without medical supervision or his consent, the security guard moved closer as David realized he'd just confessed to drugging me. His sophisticated scheme was collapsing completely, documented by medical professionals who specialized in recognizing elder abuse. The trap was almost ready. That evening felt surreal when Detective Johnson arrived to investigate what Patricia had reported as suspected elder abuse. David was growing increasingly desperate as the scope of his exposure became clear. "Mr. David, we understand you work for Elder Care Management Services. Can you explain why you brought Dr. Robert here tonight?" David's hands were shaking as he tried to explain his actions. He was confused, wandering around. I was trying to protect him. But the detective had already discovered the forged medical reports in David's car, documents claiming I'd been diagnosed with dementia by physicians who'd never examined me. "These reports are dated over the past 6 months, Detective Johnson noted, but Dr. Roberts' actual medical records show no such diagnoses or symptoms. Claire was staring at her husband with horror as each piece of evidence was revealed. David had been systematically building a false case for my incompetence while researching ways to gain control of my assets. Your plan was to have Dr. Robert declared mentally incompetent, then petition for guardianship while he was hospitalized and unable to defend himself," the detective continued. David's face had gone completely pale. His sophisticated fraud was being exposed by the very medical professionals he'd tried to deceive. He was losing control. That night, the calm before David's reckoning felt heavy with the weight of impending justice. I sat in the quiet hospital room reviewing the comprehensive evidence Patricia had methodically compiled over the past several hours. Each document, each witness statement, each piece of medical documentation that would ensure David faced serious legal consequences for his attempted exploitation. The investigation had moved with remarkable efficiency once Patricia contacted the hospital administration and local law enforcement. Within hours, they'd uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior that extended far beyond my case. David's company, Elder Care Management Services, had apparently been targeting wealthy retirees throughout the region, using family connections to gain intimate access to their lives, then manufacturing medical emergencies to justify emergency guardianship proceedings. According to Detective Johnson's preliminary investigation, I was supposed to be victim number 17 in what was essentially a systematic elder abuse operation. The company's business model was both sophisticated and ruthless: identify elderly individuals with substantial assets, infiltrate their family relationships through marriage or employment, build detailed financial profiles, then create false medical crises to gain legal control over their wealth. "Dr. Robert, I want you to know how profoundly sorry I am that this happened to you," Patricia said during her final evening check, her voice heavy with genuine regret. "If you hadn't been former senior medical staff here, if I hadn't recognized you immediately, David's plan might very well have succeeded completely." The reality was genuinely chilling when I considered how close he'd come to destroying my life. David's scheme was sophisticated enough to work against virtually any elderly target who lacked significant professional connections or insider knowledge of medical procedures. An elderly man drugged without consent and brought to emergency services in the middle of the night with detailed family accounts of progressive cognitive decline could easily have been committed for extended psychiatric observation, while guardianship paperwork was expedited through the courts. Claire had been crying intermittently since learning the full scope of her husband's betrayal. She'd called her sister in another state, sobbing as she explained that divorce papers would be filed within days, but that David's criminal charges would likely follow him for years to come. I lay in the hospital bed thinking about how David's overconfidence had led to his downfall. He'd researched my financial assets with meticulous detail, but had never bothered investigating my professional background or personal connections. In his mind, a 72-year-old man living modestly in suburban retirement couldn't possibly pose any significant threat to his carefully orchestrated plans. Tomorrow morning, David would learn that respect for elderly people isn't just a moral principle. It's also practical protection against those who mistake quiet dignity for exploitable weakness. Tomorrow, everything would change forever. But the confrontation came quietly when David returned to my room alone, probably hoping to convince me not to press charges. His desperation was obvious as he approached with trembling hands. "Dad, please," he said in low voice. "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to protect your money from poor decisions." I looked at him calmly. "By drugging me and having me committed based on forged medical records? I just wanted to make sure your assets were safe. You're getting older, and elderly people make mistakes with money." David was still trying to manipulate the situation, still believing he could convince me to cooperate with my own exploitation. "David, I spent 30 years practicing medicine at this hospital. I understand exactly what you attempted." The silence was absolute. David's face showed the moment he finally grasped the magnitude of his error. "You're not confused at all," he whispered. "No, David, I never was." He realized what I truly was. And justice came quietly the next morning when Detective Johnson formally arrested David on multiple charges of elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial exploitation. The metallic click of handcuffs around his wrists seemed to echo through my hospital room as the comprehensive list of charges was read aloud, with Claire watching in stunned silence as her husband's criminal behavior was officially documented. "David, you're being charged with drugging without consent, filing fraudulent medical reports, conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud, elder abuse, and attempted theft of assets exceeding $500,000, Detective Johnson announced with the professional detachment of someone who'd seen this pattern of criminal behavior far too many times. Patricia ensured that I was discharged within hours of David's arrest, but not before providing me with comprehensive medical documentation proving my perfect cognitive function, evidence that would be crucial for the upcoming criminal trial. The hospital's legal department had already begun preparing materials for what would clearly become a significant prosecution case with potential implications for elder care management services and their systematic targeting of vulnerable elderly victims. The drive home with Claire felt longer than usual, filled with the heavy silence of a daughter processing the devastating realization that her husband had been planning to steal her father's entire life savings while systematically destroying their family relationship. Every few minutes she would start to speak, then stop, overwhelmed by the magnitude of David's betrayal. "Dad, I'm so incredibly sorry," she finally managed as we pulled into my driveway. "I had absolutely no idea he was capable of something this calculated, this cruel. When he talked about being concerned for your welfare, I actually thought he was being thoughtful." "David was extraordinarily skilled at manipulation and deception," I replied gently. "He managed to convince even you, someone who's known and loved me your entire life, that I was becoming mentally incompetent and needed protection from my own poor judgment." The quiet revenge was complete, but it felt different than I'd anticipated. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also profound sadness about the destruction of trust and family bonds that would take years to rebuild, if they could be rebuilt at all. David had called my mind confused and attempted to have me permanently hospitalized while stealing everything I'd worked for during 4 decades of medical practice. He had learned too late that respect for elderly people isn't just a moral principle handed down through generations, It's also practical protection against predators who mistake dignity, wisdom, and careful living for exploitable weakness. Sometimes the quietest revenge really is simply allowing the truth to emerge and letting consequences follow naturally. Claire would eventually come to understand how close we'd both come to losing everything: our family relationship, our financial security, our basic trust in human decency, to someone who'd pretended to love and protect us while systematically planning our destruction. But David would spend the next several years of his life learning about the consequences of elder exploitation in environments where his considerable manipulation skills would prove far less effective than they'd been in the outside world. But justice stays silent, patient, and ultimately inevitable.